The world order is crumbling. The concept of finding a balance between great powers is redundant, as an alliance of autocratic states seeks to challenge global democracies more aggressively and directly, and the institutions that underpin their societies. Of the four, three can be classed as quasi-terrorist states, pariahs that seek to maximize chaos and violence in the world to further their own ends: Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Do we need a new concept of global powers if the West is to survive in this era, let alone to thrive, as our values and institutions come under systemic assault from the axis of autocracy? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe. You know the drill. Make sure that you are subscribed so you don't miss any of our daily content output. Please also check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It is incredibly important to help Ukrainians remain resilient while they are under assault from Putin's rabble army. Today, I'm joined by Pyotr Kurzin, who is the host of the Global Gambit podcast. His background is as an historian of great power, politics, the Cold War. He has Russian British heritage, which gives him a unique and close perspective on this topic. And I strongly advise you to take a look at some of his recent videos. He's had some extraordinary guests, such as Sir Lawrence Freedman and others. And it really is, a fantastic resource to dive into and to rewatch, because there's a lot of material, especially in that recent video. But Pyotr, welcome. And the first thing I'd like you to do is to give us a bit more about your background as well.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's nice to appear on the Silicon Curtain, a show that I've been following ardently since the full-scale invasion began, and very admiring of your on the ground work and the shows and the collaborations you've done. So thank you for having me, first of all. But secondly, yes, I am English. I am Russian. My father's from Moscow. He was born in Moscow, but he grew largely up in Novosibirsk, specifically in a satellite town called Akademgorodok, which is a sort of, well, literally translates into Academy Town. And it was the Soviets, shall we say, version of Silicon Valley. So there was a lot of STEM subjects, and my father was very reflective of that, getting his PhD in applied nuclear engineering and thermonuclear dynamics and things. But he left all of that behind to come and be with my mother upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. They actually stayed in touch for about 9 years, secretly or covertly, because it was highly illegal, obviously. I can give the very full romantic story maybe another time, but I am a product of macro events, and I think it's these geopolitical events that has made me very unable to escape my curious fascination with them. And yes, I've since gotten my master's at Johns Hopkins SAIS in the US, my undergrad in demography, and generally sort of very fascinated by the big picture, great power politics, globalization, world order sort of stuff. And the more and more we hear the rumblings of BRICS and the end of the US hegemonic status and all this sort of thing, it makes me wonder whether I should do a PhD in it or something. But that's largely where I'm coming from it at the moment. And yes, currently been previously with the UN and World Bank in Crisis Group, National Crisis Group, but now back in London and enjoying the lovely summer weather at the moment.
Well, let's dive into this, because I think we both have an interesting sort of perspective on this. You, from, as you say, your background, and you have spent certainly in your very early years a little bit of time in Russia. I was there in the 1990s, and I remember this point where I was on top of a cooling tower of Moscow State University, drinking beer and all the rest, as you do as a student, looking out over Moscow and reflecting on some of the conversations that I'd had with taxi drivers, students, and indeed the person I was sort of, sharing this. We had two small student rooms, and the person in the next room was Ukrainian. Interesting. So the first Russian I got to know actually turned out to be a Ukrainian. And I was musing on the idea, looking out over the Moscow skyline and Voробyovo Gory, there were Sparrow Hills and so on. And this thought struck me that Russia's lost the Cold War, but it really doesn't feel like it. Yes, the country's collapsed, the economy's collapsed, the USSR has collapsed, but the kind of conversations I was having showed no real understanding that that the Soviet Union had lost the Cold War. And that is because something survived. And that was a sense of Russian imperialism, a sense of Russian superiority over its near abroad, and indeed a certain regret over the loss of Eastern Europe, not any kind of triumph in their freedom, as it were, escaping from the Soviet yoke, but a certain kind of wistful nostalgia for empire. It seems to me that rather than these big theories of great power politics that some would seek to use to explain Putin's actions, in fact, the impunity, the support he gets for his actions come from something far more simple and far more local. And that is the sort of imperial chauvinism that never disappeared amongst the majority of Russians.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I would say that the pathway that Putin took towards becoming president was quite, I think, reminiscent of the Cold War era. The man is very reflective of his education or their lack of, his career, his time in Dresden, I think, was highly influential. And his ability to build this circle of people around him, you know, his keys to power, as I call them, or people like to call them, that was a long time coming. And he did that very, shall we say, persistently and specifically during the 90s. And he was very well placed upon the end of the 90s to replace Yeltsin. And I think a lot of Russians, whilst they lived in this fantasy of being free, but to do sort of, or to return to a slightly different version of prior to the Soviet Union, there was this sort of embarrassment as well. The 90s was a very dark time for a lot of former Soviet states, but the Russian Federation, you saw, I think it was a 5-year reduction in the average life expectancy of men between 93 and 94, purely down to things like alcoholism, suicide, and other very dark, traumatic things. And I think that this has been something that Putin has preyed upon a little bit, this wanting to restore confidence and belief of Russia as a great entity, and to make it feel that the Russia of yesteryear, not necessarily the Soviet Union, is possible, and that he is the man to do that, and that was only compounded by the idiocy or the seemingly very manipulable character of Yeltsin. You have the footage of Clinton standing next to Yeltsin in front of the White House, I think in 96. And, you know, the two of them laughing their heads off. And why? Because Yeltsin can barely put a word together, because he's, well, rather inebriated. So this kind of perception, I think, compounds the underlying, perhaps, desire to dominate or influence the countries in their near abroad that a lot of Russians maybe felt. And that Putin arrives. What have you got going on at the time? You have Chechnya. You have this sort of this very needed necessity to clamp down on succession, to clamp down on individual and self-determination movements. What was going on at the time was Kosovo. That was highly influential given Russia's relationship to Serbia, the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s as well. All these factors in itself were, I think, precursoring the mindset with which Putin entered office, and how Russians themselves were receiving him as well as the broader economic outlook at the time. So there's a lot of, I think, components there. Let's set aside the great power politics of it, because at the time there were no other great powers. It was the United States. It was a decade of primacy for the US. And the 2000s, we continue to see that primacy, albeit Russia was benefiting a lot from oil prices, and a lot of countries were running high. But that all began to change after 2008. Putin's revolving relationship with the West, I think, also in the early 2000s, when he was in Bush's ranch in Texas, and then the NATO Russia Council in 2002. So there was a lot of feeling here that Russia was going to be part of this this new West, this new world order. And a lot of Russians felt that that could maybe be an opportunity for them to get greater influence into Ukraine, into their former Soviet states. And that's when you began to see the color revolutions, and more specifically the Orange Revolution of '04, which I think a lot of people, be them more Kremlinites or, well, non-Russian supporters, are agreeing that the Orange Revolution was highly influential, highly influential. So I could go on, but I'll land there, because there's a whole lot of things we can talk about.
And of course, the views of those revolutions are markedly different from those who are on the outside of it in the West, markedly different in Moscow, as you say, they see them as some sort of political technology, highly influenced by the CIA. When you talk to Ukrainians, of course, they have a fundamentally different perspective again, that these were deep-seated organic movements. And this is one of the things, isn't it? Any kind of organic politics, especially where it manifests repeatedly and seems to have an impact, as the multiple Ukrainian revolutions have, these are a threat to anyone who has a dictatorial regime or a tyrannical regime, or even a hybrid regime, as Russia apparently was at that stage. I think perhaps we've overestimated the hybrid aspect. It was far more controlled and managed than we perhaps suspected through the early 2000s. But I'll take a pause and I'll cut that and I get my thoughts together. But is it the case that we're distracted somehow by this debate, because undercutting it all the way is something far more important, something far more urgent for Putin, and that is the desire to re-establish Russia as a great power. As you say, in the 90s, there was only one great power. China was on the ascendancy. Russia had fallen off that podium. And really, the single thrust of Putin's time in power has been to re-establish the perception and actuality of Russian power. And it must be especially galling that Ukraine has, in some ways, prevented that process, and in fact, pushed Russia many decades, or who knows, back away from its goal of retaining that status as a global superpower.
Yeah, I would say, before I comment on the Ukraine thing, I'd say two precursory things, which is, one, I think a lot of people don't understand or haven't read enough, and this goes more ironically for people who are fervently pro-Putin than it is for people who are, should we say, more pro-West or whatever, in that they don't understand the basics of shock therapy versus gradualism as economic reform methods, right? The Russians undertook shock therapy, the idea that you wanted to deregulate, privatize, but also undergo the transition from a centralized autocratic state to a more democratic one, albeit maybe with your own variations added to them. But that was extremely detrimental to the Russian economy and to the Russian population. And this is why we saw, as I said, some of those demographic metrics change markedly. The brain drain of the early 90s and, well, mid 90s was insane. My father arguably being one of them. You had had large cohorts of people, highly skilled, leaving the Russian economy to move to parts of Western Europe, America, and so on. And also many wealthy people who took advantage of the breakup of some of these state monopolies, some of these state companies. And suddenly overnight, you've got Abramovich, who's the governor of Chukotka, so not exactly a poor position, but becoming valued at what, $10 to $12 billion. So the market change, I think, in the structure of the political economy of Russia is so important. Compare that to China, where this was gradualism, right? You did one thing at a time. But I think where the West got it wrong with China was a fair amount of hubris, that when China would open up its markets, by default, its political system would follow. And obviously what we've learned in the past 25, 30 years is that China has proven that to be, that you can have this unique model of a centralized authoritative government model, but with a sort of capitalistic economic system. Albeit it has its problems now. But so I think those two models are very interesting to compare historically when we look back at how Russia has sort of developed into this, well, whatever you want to call it now, right? McCain calls it a gas station with, or whatever he said, right, in 2008. So
Mafia gas station.
Mafia gas station, right? A mafia gas station. And I think that Putin's The second thing, which sort of interlinks with that, is that because the Russians were feeling the squeeze a little bit in the late 90s, they had their recession. The tiger economies also didn't really play into the situation with Russia well either. You had the emergence of Putin as not only someone who could save the Russian economy, but who could restore Russia's grandiose perception on the international stage. And that has been his underlying basis throughout his premiership. But the irony there is that because Russians have never had any alternatives other than Yeltsin and Putin, they think that Putin is the only person who's capable of doing so. And in the early 2000s, you might think there is a bit of a rose-tinted glasses for some, but some analysts like to believe that that was a golden moment for the West and Russia to be collaborative where possible. Were they ever going to be united? Probably not, but there were more opportunities there. But over the 2000s, Putin's desire to sort of restore Russia's presence and reputation took over from this desire to be a world player. And you saw this with the way it voted increasingly on Security Council resolutions, and then, of course, the infamous Munich speech in 2007. And then, of course, what happened in Georgia in 2008. So this was the beginning of the shift of the relationship between Russia and the West. And I think that Putin's there was one piece that I remember reading very influential to me in my younger years about how you got different phases of Putin. And in the early 2000s, that was one phase of Putin. The later 2000s, and then after the Snow Revolution, or what the West calls the Snow Revolution in 2012, and then Crimea. And now here you've had sort of 4, maybe 5 different phases of Putin. And these phases of Putin determine the way that he governs Russia and the way that he sees the world towards Russia. And when it comes to Ukraine, it's very simple, I think, in that Ukraine, as it began to receive more influences from the West, as things began to open up after the Soviet Union, more and more Ukrainians were able to travel to the EU when the EU began these, visa schemes to come and live and stay for 3 months or whatever it would be. Those were incremental influences of, shall we say, non-Russian thought and perspectives. And the Kremlin didn't like that. And Ukraine is a country that has been stuck in a tug of war between Western interests or Western values and Russia's interests and Russia's values. And Putin can't handle the fact that there is yet another country that wants to pivot more towards the West for better economics, not necessarily. I think there was this misnomer that Ukraine would somehow never have any association with Russia. Of course, it's going to have connections with Russia, but Putin saw this as a zero-sum game, as he usually does. And Ukraine could not have any relationship with the West, with the EU, because that would mean Russia's lost any of its influence in arguably the most important country in its history with Kiev and Rus and so on. So this leads to the growing pressures, the incremental influences of political and, as you say, information manipulation and warfare, electoral fraud, and trying to install more sympathetic Russian individuals in places of positions of power and or the leadership itself. And then this all obviously comes to the fray with Georgia in 2008, and Ukrainians begin to see this as a well, this isn't just a sort of a little bit of a itch in the side of our, it's a growing actual concern now.
At this point, any talk of reconciliation, I think, is actually immoral in some ways, because there are certain things that need to happen before that conversation is even broached. But if we look back at history and how the balance of great powers has worked in the past, and indeed the processes after major wars, we see Putin has leveraged this sort of and weaponized a sense of victimhood, and he certainly used the 90s. And even when they were receding into history, he's constantly tried to revive it and make them even more sort of vivid. And he's certainly manipulated that, there's no question. And if we go back to history, the Nazis in Germany were able to use that sense of victimhood around their loss in the First World War, the highly punitive Versailles Treaty, the loss of territory, the demilitarization of big chunks of their territory, and this persistent belief that they didn't lose the war in a straight fight militarily, but they were let down by fifth columnists and people internally, a deeply kind of paranoid and conspiratorial point of view. We are potentially faced with this same challenge. Let's assume that Ukraine does actually achieve a substantive victory, which I think, following the Kursk offensive, is not so fantastical to consider. But as an abstract piece of thought, how on earth do we approach a highly bruised, malignant Russia, a post-Putin Russia, to avoid some of those mistakes that actually gave rise to Nazi Germany in the 1930s? I mean, some people would argue that Russia was already there, and that the analogy kind of breaks down from that point of view. But nonetheless, I think it's still a risk that a unsatisfactory peace will simply be a precursor to the next war.
Indeed, I think there's a lot of debate from the time that I've studied. My regional focus was Russia and Eurasia generally. And there's a lot of debate around whether or not Russia was sort of a revisionist power or was it revanchist. You might wonder, well, what's the difference? But I think it's the willingness to actually exercise your desire to change history through, well, physical territorial acquisition that is different. And this is why China, while it's made, some provocative maps, I also want to bring in a little bit more of the great power politics here, because I think when we talk about Russia, we cannot not talk about China to an increasing extent. And I think that the desire for Russia to want to reclaim former Soviet states, or at least parts of them, is not something that China has until now really actually exercised. It's talked about it, obviously, with Taiwan, and it makes a lot of provocative claims through the sort of building of the Spratly Islands and the Nine-Dash Line in the South China Sea, for example. But to actually go to war over them is not something that the Chinese Communist Party are willing to do. And I think it comes back to this mindset of gradualism or long-term thinking versus the Russia's more not the Russians can't think longer term, perhaps, but because that's just sort of, they've always been a little bit more knee-jerky. I think, and we can see that from a lot of Western analysts, I think, put Russia as the reckless power, the country that is wanting to get things done. It's very unpredictable. Putin wants so desperately to see Russia as a relevant, resurgent power, great power, the sort of one of the big three, if you like, even though it has the largest military stockpile. So I don't think anyone would not consider Russia relevant in some capacity. He still has this desire to want to reclaim even the most incremental bits of land. Russia's not exactly a small country, but for some reason he wants to take back Novorossiya, for example, or maybe the whole of Ukraine and Moldova. He wants to indirectly control the central stand states and the Caucasus. But the thing is, Russia doesn't have that economic and military capacity to do all this. Russia should really be a very wealthy, one of the most wealthy countries in the world. It's got all the resources, it's got all the know-how if you think about it, but there has been a very poor execution of this. And so when we talk about a post-Putin Russia, to bring it to your sort of more forward-looking question, I think this is extremely fascinating on one, but also harrowing on another, because better the devil you know is the term that I've come to be quite pertinent at the moment. We can talk about Putin no longer being in the picture, and trust me, there's nothing I think that I and my father and many people would like more. But the problem is the way that Putin has purged, much like Stalin did in the 30s almost, or has it simply imprisoned. Think of Paul Alexei Navalny in February of this year. Has done. He has deliberately ensured that there is no, until at least he's ready, clear successor or successional line. And I, for one, worry greatly about the post-Putin Russia, partially because you could have something like what's that film in the 90s with the Harrison Ford and there's a good film with the Americans in it. There's a good film. Basically, it talks about, right, you've got a it's a bit like the Grozny and mutiny last year, right? If Putin suddenly were to evaporate out of existence, suddenly you've got a leaderless Russia, but it has thousands of nuclear weapons. There is no clear pathway, but you've got lots of different factions vying for power, and suddenly you've got a stateless entity that has the capability of nuclear weapons. So for me, we want to think about a day after and how we can maybe engage Russia, where it's appropriate. But equally, we need to think about, what does that look like? It's extremely difficult to think about a post-Putin Russia because of the way that he's created the state around him so much. None of the systemic opposition, the communists or the liberal, Democratic Party, which is ultranationalist actually, and whatever the fourth one is, none of them are actual legitimate entities. They all just agree with whatever Russia's foreign policy is, and I don't exactly think Mikhail Mishustin is a decent leader, nor do I think I never get their names right. Patrushev is either. So one would love to think about a Russia that is more constructive, more, adhering to international law and norms. But if you can't get a clear idea of what its domestic situation is going to be in that regard, it's incredibly difficult to think about it from a just international order perspective. I don't know if you would agree with my sentiment or if you have an answer to this conundrum, but
I think it's massively challenging, and I tend to side with the Ukrainians in this. I mean, their instinct is to say they would love to see Russia disappear. Well, that is not going to happen. There's a lot more emphasis paid on nationalities and their potential role in the fragmentation of Russia. Again, I don't unfortunately see that happening either, because ethnic Russians form the majority in many, many areas, and even where they're not, they hold the key roles of influence within academia, administration, and key roles within the industrial base. So I don't see that fragmentation, but at the same time, the Ukrainian lesson for me suggests that you will not get substantive change unless you devolve power radically down to a local level. And by that, I don't mean just sort of oblasts and local, councils and so on, but right down to people at the level of individual apartment blocks, streets, radical democratization. And decentralization is one of the reasons why Maidan was successful, and of course that accelerated massively after Maidan, and helps to explain why Ukraine and civic society has pulled together to survive now this latest onslaught. Such a program of radical decentralization, empowerment of people, and introduction of competition into every single aspect of life, including religion and politics, I think is the solution. But how you do that, and I don't see too many of the Russian opposition talking about these things and the mechanics of how you roll back the sort of Soviet paranoid state. So yes, I don't see much hope there, and I don't see the West really paying nearly enough attention, or indeed either understanding the mechanics of how Ukraine has got on the process of liberating itself from I would say, the sort of Soviet or Russification. Yeah, I don't hold too much hope out, but I think having conversations about it, exploring what Ukraine has achieved and where it's failed, or where things have gone slowly, I think is a very useful process, which, alas, the media doesn't, spend too much time on these topics. But I think they're incredibly important.
No, just to add to that, I think, I mean, obviously Maidan was a CIA-backed coup. Victory Nuland. What else? What other stupid sound bites can I throw in there from the Kremlinites? Right? Whenever you say Maidan, that sets off people, which always hilarious. Just quibs aside, I want to double down what you said there, because I think the geography, like sheer just actual geographical size and demographics, is not something that is paid enough attention to, not necessarily by you specifically, but I mean by people who sort of pretend to be experts on this. But Ukraine, I think, is a country that has the capacity to do it, although it's going to be challenging as well. Ukraine's a big country. And this desire to want to sort of incorporate it into the European Union is going to take time, because you're having to reconfigure, restructure so much of the economic, the corruption systems, which Ukraine has done remarkably well in a short space of time. Even during the war, there's been clampdowns on it, which I think is quite extraordinary. But then if we think about it with Russia, right, both countries have a demographic issue, albeit for different reasons. Um, and this new decree that Putin has sort of announced in the past, what, 2 or 3 days, sort of welcoming anyone of almost any background at all, I think is symbolic of the fact that Russia has a population situation. Depopulation, not just because of brain drain or people wanting to get out to avoid conscription, but also just because of the loss of lives from the war. And I think that this is something that generally also the way that the demographic composition of Russia is incredibly obstructive to the successes of the country. You have 70% more or less of the Russian population west of the Ural Mountains, and then the rest is just, you know, pineland and fjords and sort of things, right? Grizzly bears and Siberian tigers, but it's not a very easy way to build a well-functioning state, infrastructure, telecommunications, energy transitions. It's a very difficult thing to make the country function effectively. And because the government has been, or Putin specifically, has been more interested in meddling in other countries' affairs, particularly in the near abroad and its sphere of influence, he's neglected the ability to actually make Russia in the longer term far more influential by making it more wealthy. If you actually executed your settlements in different areas as much as you are trying to sort of destabilize the Balkans or something, then you could by default actually get more countries interested in working with you and greater sort of exchange of ideas, human capital, knowledge economies, all these things developing, right? But it's a very sort of narrow and sort of tunnel visioned approach by the Kremlin. And Ukraine has gone the better way of trying to seek that external sort of influences of alternative ideas, FDI, ODA, or overseas development aid in some cases, right? You know, all these things have seen
technology is a good one there. I mean, the
technology.
massive growth in the tech economy that's come from nowhere.
Well, Grammarly is Ukrainian, right? You've got a few massive startups that have started it. I mean, look at Bolt in Estonia. It's very impressive. So Russia has lost this opportunity, and I think that because Ukraine was deliberately trying to do the thing that Russia should have done, they that is what antagonized Putin and has led to the developments of the past 15 years. Now the problem is that the country, as in Ukraine, is so decimated by the war in the east. How much is it going to cost to help rebuild, and is the Ukrainian economy going to be resilient enough to continue to grow in a way that it was before 2022? It was doing pretty well despite the developments in the Donbass since 2014. But that's something else we can maybe touch upon.
Yeah, I mean, I've got conversations over the next couple of months about reconstruction, and hopefully we'll take an honest look at that, because I think some of the talk around rebuilding the East is fanciful, to say the least. And yes, Ukrainians will privately, give you a slightly different picture on that, a slightly more realistic picture of that. Well, let's keep with our sort of great powers type theme. And of course, China was one of those four in the axis of authoritarian states. I would not class them as terrorist state. They do seem to think about their actions. They do seem to exert some kind of caution. And their leadership, I think, cannot be characterized as mafiosi. Whatever criticisms we level at them, their lack of innovation, that Xi Jinping seems to not understand the role of entrepreneurialism, and that's having an impact on the Chinese economy. He is a dictator. There's no question there. He has purged people internally. He's not. I would say he's as far from a democratic representative leader you can get. Nonetheless, I do get the impression that the Chinese hierarchy do have a nod to their people. They're not simply there to skim the country of its resources. China is an interesting position here, isn't it? It must be watching what's happening in Russia very, very closely. And the Kursk offensive may well change, or is changing, China's thoughts on how far it gets involved in this conflict. And I think it may well be deciding to perhaps, and there are evidence that it already is, the alliance with Russia is not quite as cozy and helpful as Putin would like to have us believe.
No, I mean, firstly, the Chinese or Sino-Russo relationship is a marriage of strategical convenience. It's nothing more and nothing less. It's the quintessential example of, you don't have friends, you have interests. And the Chinese are friendly with the Russians. The Russians are very friendly with Beijing, but the Chinese are knowing that Russia is a means to an end. We can see this through many examples, but most, I think, recently and entertaining is the relationship over the Siberian pipeline. The Russians, it's still in process of being built, Siberia 2, and has been for a long time. And the Russians and the Chinese back in June are having a bit of a loggerheads because the Russians want a certain price for the oil, and the Chinese are not willing to pay that, and the Russians know that they don't really have any leverage at all. Two comments about Xi Jinping. Yeah, I agree. I think he is. Well, this is the interesting thing, I think, when you compare Russia and China. They're very different political models and systems, but the Chinese are an illustration of what you can do, even if you have a more centralized command structure versus Russia. In that it's not just sort of Putin is the Tsar, really, is a neo-Tsar of Russia, whilst it is the party with President Xi, who has centralized power much more around just himself, but it is still a little bit more, there is a little bit more of a diversification of power. And the Chinese have brought, 800 million plus people out of poverty over 40 years, but they've also done some terrible things. And one-child policy is wreaking havoc now. The demographic dividend for China really is beginning to, has ended about 20 years ago, and it's really eating into the economy now. Depopulation, I guess depopulation more in Russia, and it's more the demographic imbalance. For every 100 women, you have about 120 men, so 1 to fifth more, and it's extremely detrimental. And there's another thing which I think is really interesting when you look at this from a sort of in the context of Ukraine and just generally power politics, which is that a lot of things coincided, which may well have influenced the decisions and how we, if one thing is slightly different, different universal timeline, things could be very different. But at the time when Putin was experiencing the snow revolution in St. Petersburg and Moscow and other urban areas, President Xi was coming to power. And at that time, China was a much more collaborative force. Hu Jintao was more, I think, engaging constructively with the West. And then you suddenly got Putin, who's won his 3rd term as president, and President Xi Jinping, who's now come into power. And what does he want to do? He wants to strongly assert that China is on the international stage, no longer as a sort of follower or bystander, but as a leader. And this idea of wolf warrior diplomacy has defined China's approach to international politics in the past decade, the BRI, BRICS more broadly. And I think Putin found a bit of a kindred spirit in President Xi. And we've seen how close those two get on. It's difficult to really tell what their personal relationship is like, but I think Putin is quite not idolizing, but he looks to President Xi as a sort of someone he can come to with ideas or rely on for support. But in the past 5 years, with COVID and the internalization of Russia and Putin, which again, I think go back to the phases, I think that was another influence that affected Putin's mindset and the way he approaches foreign policy. That's really changed, I think, the Chinese relationship. And if you'd asked me a few years ago, would Russia ever become a sort of vassal state to China, I would have laughed at you, because I think the Russian mentality is too proud to be a vassal. But arguably speaking, with the way that the war has gone, particularly since 2022, Russia's dependency on China is stark. And you have the senior partner to the junior partner and those positions being shifted. But a very good example for me is last year when the Chinese brought out this incredibly provocative map. Some of your viewers may remember it. And it was basically the Chinese's updated territorial claims to some of its borders. And one of them, it was a very tiny bit of land, but it was still a bit of land in Russia. specifically Manchuria, and obviously the Manchurian conflict of 69 to 71, if I remember, or the border clashes, was quite an important moment for the Sino-Russo or Soviet relationship. And the fact that the Chinese made this like territorial claim to their supposed main strategical partner is interesting, mainly because the Russians didn't say anything. So the Russians don't really have a leg to stand on. And the Chinese know this, and they are pressing them tacitly. I think that they're quietly putting pressure on Moscow. And I do wonder whether or not, to bring it back to Ukraine and obviously the offensive and incursion, what does this mean for the Russians? The Chinese look to the Ukrainian war, to Russia's invasion, and what it means for their own interests over Taiwan. A war between Russia and Ukraine is one thing, but the war between China and Taiwan is another, and potentially even worse or more costly for the said actors involved, not playing down the travesties that have happened in Ukraine. But they're not impressed, I can tell you that. And they're certainly surprised, I think, by the resilient defiance of Ukraine, but also the united support of NATO and the US and West more broadly. And I think it has made China a little bit more wary of how they conduct themselves in their own near abroad, not pretending to know the future. But if you look at this and you think that that doesn't have an influence on the mindset of the CCP and President Xi, then that's mistaken.
The last question then is really about international law, international institutions, and I start with the the phrase that was in the introduction, the idea that international institutions are fundamentally broken, especially when you look at the UN and the fact that Russia, that is acting as a terrorist state, that is flouting numerous international laws, is flouting many dozens of treaties that it itself signed with territories of the former Soviet Union, as well as members of NATO. It is broken so many of those agreements and seems to have nothing actually but contempt for the idea of treaties and legal agreement, opting for the informal power relations and the at times mafia style conducting of those that we've seen. With Russia there as a permanent member of the Security Council, are international institutions fundamentally broken? And how do we get back to a system of, I would say, much more sort of robust, dependable, and predictable international order? Or is it gone forever?
I don't think it's gone. I mean, this is what I should write a dissertation about, right? But I don't think it's gone. I would say a couple things before I try to sort of have a go at such a challenging question. But I think what Putin did on February 24th, fundamentally, and we touched upon this with Sir Lawrence Friedman in the conversation you mentioned, which is that might is right. This idea that you can use hard power or military force to get what you want. That was not something that we saw in quote unquote the developed world, right? It was something that countries that are still developing might resort to, but also for what we consider to be a great power, or Russia wants to be seen as a great power, resorting to the quip that I like to say, I think we had it in our own chat in the another day, was that Russia was considered the second most powerful military in the world. That's considered the second most powerful military in Russia after Ukraine. Is that this resort of hard power completely throws out the idea of the peace dividend and as being able to use dialogue, diplomacy, patience to sort of get things resolved. So that's point number one, which is severely shaking the post Second World Order, the Bretton Woods, and all that sort of stuff. Secondly, on the UN, I mean, I believe, maybe naively or idealistically, in what the UN is trying to do. This idea that you have a platform, a venue, a place that you can come to air your grievances and try to find some amicable way, diplomatic way forward. That's not to deny that the UN in practice has been quite miserable in its succeedings, but it has also managed to do some things which have improved. I don't know, the arbitrary example, the UN Charter of the Sea. In 1982, the idea, if you know the Cod Wars between Iceland and the UK, it was Iceland's creation of its own economic exclusive zone, or EEZ, which is what the UN used as a basis and is now basically adopted by every nation state worldwide. So the UN does have some capacity to provide international norms and standards, but when you have a country that is led by someone like Putin that is so vagantly dismissing anything that it's in itself, as you say, agreed to, that completely undermines its legitimacy. The problem is that it's not easy to simply remove Russia off the Security Council. People want to do this, and I was quite impressed when the Ukrainian delegation suggested that because Russia, when the Soviet Union broke up, Russia's claim to being the default, acquirer of that Security Council seat, permanent seat, they were like, well, we've got a legitimate bid here, and I thought that was quite a remarkable suggestion. International law, I don't think, agreed with that, and I find it incredibly difficult to see how Russia could be removed or suspended. But that makes me think that it is time for a modernization. Maybe you could have an exit clause or a freeze out, more options that give the ability for the broader international community to leverage some kind of influence against a specific actor. It's pretty clear that whilst countries like India and Serbia have, continued to benefit from Russia's cheaper energy supplies, they did, in principle, symbolically vote against Russia's invasion on February 24th in the various UN General Assembly votes. Now, whether or not you think they account for anything is another matter. But you can get rid of the UN. You can scrap it and make something else, but that won't remove the issues that arise. And we're already seeing that with BRICS. The bigger an organization gets, the more voices you have to account for, and the more bloated it becomes, and the slower and less efficient it is. So all these people who like to claim that the Western-led order is finished and that this new Chinese, Russian, autocratic axis is here, or they're just going to say non-Western axis is here. That doesn't solve the issues that you've got to get people to agree. At the end of the day, nation states are made up of us as a society, and if the society is not going to be homogenous, then you're going to have differences of opinion, and those differences of opinion are going to lead to obstructions and limitations and fights, and so I don't think we are seeing a collapse of the international order, to bring it back to the original question. I certainly think we're in a more multipolar world. I don't, again, get too carried away in thinking that the US is suddenly going to evaporate tomorrow, that Europe is going to collapse or implode. And neither do I think that that's the case for Russia. I certainly think that you could see parts of Dagestan or maybe Chechnya break away, Chechnya particularly, given their proximity to other smaller states in the Caucasus. But generally, I think that the international system is in a very disruptive period. We're all scrambling to know how to deal with generative AI. Technology is leaps and bounds ahead of our regulations. Big tech is something that we have to consider, and non-state actors, what's happening in the Middle East, and Russia's willingness to support entities like Hamas or Hezbollah, just so that it can continue to destabilize other countries for its own interests, shows you that the, shall we say, coherence or cohesiveness, better rather, of the international order is definitely here with us. But I don't necessarily think that we're going to see a collapse of the Western one. I just think we're going to see a diversification towards maybe more regional blocks. Right, a lot of this has also been influenced, last point, on globalization. The globalization has been this sort of sticking point that has blended so many economies together and made us all better off, at least in the absolute sense, relatively, maybe not so much. But that seems to be going away or reversing, and countries are getting more and more, EU's focusing on its own self, America's looking towards its nearer ball with reshoring. And Russia's looking to Asia, and whether or not all this means that the international order is somehow continues to flag along. I just think we're in for a pretty rough ride. It's not the smooth sailing that it was for the past 20 years, 30 years, and it's in my entire lifetime. And I think that people have gotten, particularly us in Europe, have gotten used to a very sort of cushy lifestyle, and Putin's invasion is the sort of the flashpoint, the inflection point, which has starkly kick-started this whole shift towards this more unpredictable order, if that makes sense.
Well, we're definitely in for a bumpy ride. I think that's one thing we can say for sure, and it gives plenty of grounds for further conversations. Pyotr, I advise people to check out your channel. You've had some fantastic conversations, including with Lawrence Friedman and others recently. We'll put a link to that in the description of the video. But for now, thanks so much for coming on Silicon Curtain, and I look forward to our next chance to have a chat.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I hope I enjoy and provided value to your viewers and your show. See you next time.